Mr. Secretary, President Biden is holding a climate summit at the White House for 2 days, and he's made some major announcements already today, really ramping up the U.S. commitment. Give us a sense of what it would take to cut our greenhouse gas emissions by as much as 50 or 52% by the end of this decade.
Well, this is going to take an extraordinary, unprecedented national effort, but it's also something that we can't afford not to do. Just today, there was a new report out by the insurance industry estimating that if we allow climate change to run rampant, it could cost the global economy $23 trillion by the middle of the century. So we know what we have to do, and we know that that's going to require concrete, specific steps in every part of the economy. In the transportation sector, which is actually the biggest contributor of greenhouse gases here in the U.S., we've definitely got our work cut out for us, but we have a roadmap for that work in things like the American Jobs Plan, the president's infrastructure vision, that's going to set up the U.S. to compete and win on these terms.
So I'm glad you mentioned the transportation factor, because I'm not sure I understood that something like 28% of U.S. greenhouse gases come from the transportation sector. So if you really take a look at the total number, it's something I think around 6 billion metric tons of carbon dioxide equivalents a year. So if you take 30% of that, that's a lot. And to cut that in half, how are you going to get that much carbon dioxide out of the air from transportation?
Well, we start with the direct emissions, and the best way to think about that is things like the tailpipe of a car. It's why there is a race to get electric vehicles adopted and produced in this country, by the way. You know, the world's already moving in the direction of electric vehicles, but the big question is whether they're going to be vehicles produced in the U.S. by American workers, preferably union workers making good wages, or whether other countries are going to lead the way. It's why the Jobs Plan calls for a network of charging stations. We're going to deploy 500,000 of them over the course of the next decade, as well as other measures like tax incentives and rebates in order to make sure that, that we speed up the adoption of EVs. But it's not just what's coming directly out of a vehicle. There are a lot of indirect effects too, the kinds of fuels that go into our aircraft, for example. They're not all alike. There's a move toward what's called sustainable aviation fuels that have dramatically less in terms of emissions associated with them. This really is about every different dimension of how people and goods move around the country and move around the world. No one piece is going to get it done, but taken together, if we act aggressively, we can make this happen and, importantly, create a lot of jobs while we're at it.
Yeah, everything I've heard suggests that if you're going to achieve this sort of really robust goal, everything has to be done. There's nothing that can be left behind. At the same time, when you look at that 28% more or less of greenhouse gas emissions from transportation, the lion's share of that comes from small and medium-sized vehicles, and a lot of the rest of it comes from heavy-duty vehicles. Certainly aircraft are important, but it's not that big a chunk when you look at it. If you were to stop all internal combustion engine sales today and just only sold electric vehicles, which we're not equipped to do, it would take about 15 years to turn over the fleet.
That's right. That's why we're not only trying to drive electric vehicle adoption, but also continue pursuing robust standards in terms of the emissions of internal combustion engines. They're not going away overnight. There are going to be a lot of them on the road. Even if when you get to that point where all new cars being sold are electric, you'd still, of course, have the vehicles that have been sold over the years on the road. That's one of the reasons why we can't let down our guard on fuel emission standards. And you're going to be seeing more from that from us soon, pursuant to the president's day one executive order to look at the rules and regs that we're inheriting. And by the way, every time that we've challenged the American auto industry to do this, they have risen to that challenge, but it doesn't just happen on its own. Now, let's also remember that when you do have something like an electric vehicle, that's only as clean as the power that's going into it. That's why this is really not something you can do one sector at a time or one department at a time. Just yesterday, I was spending a lot of time with the Energy Secretary, Granholm, and her team, because we got to make sure that we're tightly coordinated on the effort to get a greener grid, even as we're trying to make sure that the vehicles are capable of taking advantage of that new clean power that's growing so quickly in the U.S.
Can you get to where you need to go? On the transportation side, let's just take that one for the moment. That's your responsibility. Without Congress.
Well, we really are calling on Congress to provide the resources and the policy direction to move forward. And again, this isn't just about electric vehicles, although that's a big part of it. This is about how we're going to build our cities in the years to come, paying attention to things like transit-oriented development. You know, it's one thing to make sure that a vehicle is cleaner, has no emissions. It's another to make sure that you have an option of getting to where you need to be without a vehicle. You shouldn't have to drag 2 tons of metal along with you everywhere you go. And if we make it easier to access transit, create more reliable and dense transit networks, and build up housing so that you can bike or take a bus or take a subway or train to get to where you're going, that's going to fit into it as well. But yes, we need Congress to act. We need Congress to lead. And a huge step in that direction is for Congress to pass the American Jobs Plan that the president's put forward.
And as you say, Mr. Secretary, the American Jobs Plan does include elements that would go to climate, things like charging stations, something that you mentioned, no doubt about it. But if you got everything in the American Jobs Act, and that hasn't happened yet, if you got everything, would there need to be yet more legislation to accomplish, again, for transportation, what you need to get done if you're going to make that target of 2030?
Well, this is a whole of government and whole of society effort. So no one piece of legislation, even an enormously important one like the jobs plan, is going to be the whole story, especially because there are things like the technologies that haven't yet fully developed, like we were talking about with aviation fuel, a lot of change coming to how people get around that will, by 2030, look quite different. I'm following the development, for example, of automated vehicles, which may fundamentally transform our relationship to our cars, especially if it leads to more people experiencing a car as a service rather than as a possession. That's still a few years out, but we need to be thinking ahead, even as we're acting in the moment, because really it's across the 2020s that we're either going to make it or we're going to fail. And we'll know the answer to that by the middle of the century, when I'm hoping to retire. And when that happens, I hope to be looking back saying that we met the moment before it was too late.
You'll be retiring before I do. I think that's exactly right. So let's talk, though, about the American Jobs Plan. And particularly, are you going in two different directions at the same time, to some extent? Because you're going to be building more roads, more bridges, more tunnels, which will encourage more people to drive. And you know well, going back to the 40s in this country, we've had, from Robert Moses on down, a real bias toward internal combustion engines. We did not do mass transit, which I think has contributed to the problem we have today.
Yeah, this is a great point. On one hand, the interstate highway has a lot of has a lot of magnificent impact, but also had a lot of negative impact in terms of equity and in terms of this mentality that the only way to get around is a car, and the only purpose of roads and streets is to blow vehicles through them as quickly as possible. We've come to see it a little bit differently in the 21st century, understanding, especially in the hearts of cities, that streets are for moving cars around, but also sidewalks and pedestrians and bicycles. All of these things need to fit together. And so what we really need to do is have our whole transportation strategy revolve around human beings and our lives, rather than having it revolve around the car. The car is a classically American invention. It's always going to be an important part of that. My hometown of South Bend really grew up around automobile manufacturing, but it's part of a bigger story. And as we look to the future, we got to repair what we have. We got to improve it. Sometimes we got to add. Sometimes we got to subtract. And all of that has to be part of an integrated system whose fundamental purpose is to get people to where they need to be equitably, affordably, safely, and sustainably.
Mr. Secretary, what the President is laying out, and what his team, including you, are really laying out, is a very bold vision on climate. It has not always been a straight line the United States of America has traveled when it comes to climate issues. We're taking some big V-turns around, back and forth on climate. Let me ask the most stark question. Can a democracy deal effectively with climate? There's no doubt that if you are in an autocracy, if you're President Xi, you can basically make the country go wherever you want to go, pretty much when you want it to go there. We have an election every 4 years for president, every 2 years for Congress. Is it inconsistent with democracy to make real progress on a long-term problem like climate?
I would say only a democracy can rise to this challenge as effectively as we seek to do here in the United States, although we're counting on nations of the world with different systems to find their way to get there. In a way, it reminds me of the question that was being called in the middle of the last century. At the time, it was, can a democracy fully industrialize and swiftly deliver modern technology? People were looking with admiration sometimes at what Germany was doing. People were looking at the Soviet model and everything that was going on with industrialization. But in the end, it proved that the American model was the most robust. The president still believes, and I certainly believe, in the American model, the democratic model. But we are calling the nations of the world, whatever their system might be, to recognize that this is a challenge that doesn't care about our ideologies. The climate doesn't care about our politics. The climate is going to do what it's going to do. And we've got to make sure our inputs stop it from going to a point that is just incompatible with prosperity by the middle of this century.